Well, good day, everyone, and welcome back. This is episode 4 of the Autocannon, the 90mm gun platform based on the Lancia truck. And today we're going to be working on the base, the diorama base. A few inspiration photos just to kind of get things started here. I like these photos of these gun emplacements where they've got, what little environment they can to kind of do a little protection and perhaps camouflage, stacking up some rocks and such around the base of the guns. So that's kind of the theme that I'll be using as I start to construct this base. A little bit of a rock outcropping just to maybe break up the silhouette of the truck. Well, the first thing I need to decide is just what size of a base that I'm going to make it on. So this is a 12 by 11 piece of, actually it's a little bit of a box. I just have it turned upside down. And I also have an 8 by 8 piece of wood. This came from the craft store. And I'm just trying to figure out which size fits this gun best. And I do have some figures that are going to go along with it as well. Traditionally, the smaller the size base, the more compact it is, the better in general. But I also kind of like the idea of this little bit larger base, just because it kind of helps with the expanse of the desert theme a little bit, just gives a little bit more area. But in the end, I went ahead and decided to use the 8 by 8 piece of wood. Over the top of that, I'm just going to go ahead and once again use some of that insulation foam. And this will give me some actually nice rough texture to kind of carve into. And I can maintain that rough texture as well to give me that kind of rocky desert appearance. A little bit of PVA glue all over the board just so I can lay down these pieces of foam. This is a very imprecise process. As you can see, like I said, the foam itself is really rough cut because I planed it in half. I cut it in half so it's half as thick as it used to be. And I do like that rough surface on it because that's going to come in handy again when I start using that texture to create the rocky surface of the desert landscape. And any of the overlap around the edges of the base with this foam, I'll just be able to cut off with the hobby knife. And that's especially easy once the glue is dried and the foam is secured to the base. Once the glue's dry and the foam is securely in place, it's time to go ahead and start building up the actual base itself. The first thing that I need to do is make sure that all my contact points of the truck, the wheels, and these outriggers are all making nice contact onto the base. And for that, I once again turn to the Magic Sculpt, and it's just a matter of just kind of pushing it in around the edges of all those little platforms and a little bit underneath, just to make sure everything is in contact. Well, this is probably good as time as any just to give a little bit of a heads up without trying to give away too much, but it is a little bit of a spoiler alert. This project, well, it didn't go exactly, this diorama base, not exactly as smoothly and as much as I had planned. So there's going to be, as we get to the end of this, quite a big, I don't know what you call it, detour, left turn, crash and burn. I'm not sure how you want to put it. So stay to the end. We'll cover that when we get there. But in the meantime, let's get back to working on this base because regardless of what happens later, this is how this base gets constructed. I went ahead and made some balsa wood strips here to length, and I'll use those as the sidewalls around the base too, just to give it a nice edge. And this is one of the reasons why I like to use a wooden base as the bottom of my platforms, because it makes, well, first, it's nice and square, and secondly, it gives it a nice edge in which I can glue these pieces onto the wood. And then once these edge pieces have dried, the glue is dried on those, then it's easy just to come back in, because again, I did not necessarily square up these pieces of foam. They're just roughly to size. And so any of these gaps, just use a little bit of the Magic Sculpt and just fill up those little gaps and edges and fix the corners and make everything nice and even. Next, we'll start working on what will be the actual texture for this rocky desert type of landscape. And over the top of all the foam and the Magic Sculpt, I begin by applying a layer of the AK acrylic paste. This is called Rough Texture, very appropriately named. It's got a lot of sand in this paste. And so once it dries, it really makes a nice, like I said, rough, bumpy sort of a texture. And the other nice part about it is that these pastes are acrylic, so they can be thinned with water, and so it makes it nice and easy to spread and even out over the entire surface. If you recall from those reference photos, we're talking about a really rough, rocky environment, at least this part of the desert where I'm going to set this vehicle. And so I need a whole lot of rocks, little rocks and stones. And yes, I could go out and try to find a bunch of them, but it happens to be pouring down rain at the moment, and I don't want to go outside. So next best thing is make my own rocks. In this bowl, I'm just mixing up some of the dry plaster powder with water, and I'm going to be making a thick paste from that, so just basically making plaster. And then in a second bowl, I'll just line that with a little bit of plastic wrap, and this is just to keep things from sticking. And then I'll just pour this paste into this second bowl here, and we'll set this aside. This actually took I left it for overnight, so it takes a while. Like I said, this diorama base, there's a lot of steps in it that take a lot of curing time or drying time for these different types of paste and the plasters and such. So it's not a quick base to put together, that's for sure. Next morning, my plaster is all ready to go. And you can always tell when the plaster is ready to go if you tap it a little bit. It's almost got like a glass sound to it. It makes a little pinging, tinging sound versus a dull thud. Now to make the small rocks. Yep, good old hammer. So we're just going to pound this out a little bit, and plaster is surprisingly resilient. It's pretty hard, so it takes a couple of pretty good whacks before I start breaking off a few pieces here. But once it starts, it's much easier, and you can just start chipping it away. And what I'm looking to do here is just get a lot of shapes. These are going to be really rough shapes of the rocks, rough rocks, and I want to break them down into scale size. So always keep in mind these are 1/35th scale figures. And like I said, I'm going to be piling up a rock wall to kind of mask or camouflage part of the vehicle. And so I want to make sure these rocks are in keeping with something that these guys could actually pick up. But first things first, let's put a bunch of rocks into the surface. And again, I want to make sure these rocks are part of the surface rather than just floating on top of the surface. So I just use my tweezers and a little bit of PVA glue and just make some indentations into the foam. And I'll just go ahead and place these rocks into these little divots. And then, like I said, they'll become part of the scene and within the scene versus just kind of floating on top of the groundwork itself. So I've got a little bowl of rocks there. Just start pulling out little ones and squeezing them into those little divots. I'm always thinking about ways to enhance or improve the texture of this rocky terrain. And what I've done is added just a little bit of watered down PVA glue over the surface. This is over the top of that rough terrains paste. And I'm just using some of the powder and the little smaller granules, the little chips from that plaster, and just sprinkling that over the top as well. And this will just give a little bit more random roughness and texture to the whole scene. So this is a good time to take a look at where we stand right now. I've got pretty much all the textures in place. I got to start on that rock wall. I think I've got the vehicle leveled out. More about that later when everything starts going sideways. But let's continue on with this because at this point, I'm feeling good. Everything is going great. Let's push on. Well, you can never have too many textures in my world, and let's add one more. This is Sandy Desert, as the little jar says. And this type of a paste, this once again is an acrylic paste, but this paste has a very much finer texture to it. So it mimics fine dirt or sand as it dries. And again, these are acrylic paste, so I'm going to thin it down fairly heavily here with water and almost use it as a wash over the surface. And this will really help tie all those different aspects of the textures that I've already added. It'll start bringing everything together. So I'll have little deposits here and there of sand. I'll have these rocks kind of poking through, and I'll have that grittiness from the plaster that I added and the rough textures earlier, and even the rough carving of the foam. All this will become unified under this paste and really start pulling everything together. I have one more idea for some nice texture, and that's to use the cracked and dry earth. This is, again, an acrylic paste, and when it dries, however, it dries and cracks, so it kind of shrinks up and cracks and gives that really nice dry, arid earth effect. Through practice with this paste, I've learned that you can sort of control the size or the texture of the cracks simply by the amount of paste that you use. So for instance, a very thin coating, a skim coat of the paste, and allowed that to dry, will produce very fine cracks and details. Or if you have a real thick layer, and that's kind of what I'm doing here, is a pretty thick, substantial layer, that will produce very large cracks. And once dry, again, this was overnight, nice hard surface with which to work on. And again, it's important, no matter what type of effects that you're using, is that they become integrated within the rest of the scene. So At first, this looks like some sort of a dry lake bed just sitting in the corner of the scene here. And that's not the effect I'm looking for. That's not the appearance I want. So again, using my little rocks and making divots and using the PVA glue, I'm going to add some stones into this area. And I'll do a little bit of light washes with some of those sand textures just to integrate this cracked effect within the context of the entire scene. And then I just follow the same process on this area as I have on the rest of the scene, and that is a little light wash of PVA glue in certain areas, and just a fine light sprinkling of some of that plaster powder and some of those little smaller chips, just to give this surface, again, a little bit more integration with the remainder of the scene. And then finally, and just again, in certain areas, I just add a little bit of that wash of that sandy desert acrylic paste. And again, I'm not trying to cover up that cracked texture. I just want to integrate it within the scenes. So a little bit of texture here and there, but also allowing that cracked earth to show through. And that'll just make a nice, interesting little visual cue here in this corner. At this point, I've got so many different types of textures and colors and whatnot going on here that I really just feel like I need to unify the color base in order so I can get a better idea of where I stand in terms of progress. So I'm going ahead and give a first base color of my desert colors onto the scene here. And well, you guessed it, the colors that I'll be using to paint the base are the exact same colors that I used to paint the Autocannone. So I begin with a buff color. And then over that, I just start adding a little bit of highlights here and there on some of these stones and the higher edges in places using the Russian gray color. So it's a nice light sandy color. So it's really popping out some of those highlights. You might notice right about here that I really lowered the angle of my airbrush. So the elevation is almost horizontal to the base. And by spraying this way, I can just pick up the highlights of the terrain. So it's almost like dry brushing, but it's like using the airbrush. That's a really handy effect just so I can start pulling out some of the details and picking out some of the details. Now it's time to really start making it pop, and we'll do that with paints, both oil paints and acrylics. The first thing I do is start with the oil paints, and I first add a little bit of shadows, and that's with sepia. And I just add a few shadows around some of those little larger rocks and boulders that are set in the scene. And now I'm going to go ahead and tint the base itself. So these are basically washes, oil washes. And as you might have guessed, once again, these are exactly the same colors that I used to use on the oil paints when I did on the Lancia truck. So it's ochre, sepia, and actually I use a little bit of earth on this as well. Then I come back in and I'm starting to use the acrylic colors. And this is where that, fun, relaxing, tedious, whatever you want to call it, part of the scene comes together, where you just start pulling out and picking out and painting each individual little rock and highlight and detail. And this is when everything really starts to pop, because you've got a little bit of contrast here from that shadowing you did with the oil paints early on and some of those washes. And now you just pull up all these little highlights, these little sparkles and specks and such on the surface. And now the scene really starts to come together and starts to jump to life. Well, I like those effects, how it's coming together. You can see on the base colors especially that it's still pretty splotchy. The colors aren't really unified. I do like the different tones that I have there, but they don't look real natural. At least they're not unified quite yet. And one easy way of bringing everything together, give a little bit of unification, is just with this light wash of acrylic color. I've chosen to mix up just a little bit of a light sand color, and I'm just applying it pretty much overall. And that will pretty much harmonize and unify the appearance and bring everything together into one sort of a color tone. The base colors underneath will still show through, and some of this wash will accumulate in some of those lower areas, and they'll look like sand deposits, an added little bonus. Next step will be to add pigments, and this will be the first time on this entire project that I've used pigments. And once again, this is kind of one of the reasons I bring up the model to a certain stage, because now I can start bringing everything together at once. So the colors I choose here on this base, I'll be able to go back in onto the model itself and add some of these same pigment colors, and this will once again help tie everything together and make it a real nice unified appearance. But you can see in the little cup that I initially started with 3 colors of pigments, but it didn't take long for me to kind of decide that brighter color, the sienna, the brighter orange color, was just a little bit too vibrant for this scene. So primarily I'm going to be using the Africa dust and the alkaline dust, those 2 colors in combination, to give this a nice dusty arid appearance. And I do take a little bit of time and play with it a little bit. So the lighter color, the alkaline dust, the just off-white color, I tend to use those on the highlighted areas just to reinforce a little bit of those upper edges, a little bit of zenithal light if you want to call it that. And I could do that a little bit with the pigments. And the thing you're probably thinking in the back of your head right now is like, hey, Rick, you just cover it up with those pigments, all of that paint work you did earlier. You can't even see that. And yeah, you're right. At this stage, especially when you apply them dry like this, that tends to happen. But I have a little bit of a trick here that I think is going to help settle those down and once again, help integrate everything into the surface. My idea here is to give the entire surface a wash using odorless thinner. And it's going to be a fairly generous, heavy wash of thinner. And the brush is a very large brush. And I'm not necessarily being very gentle as I'm applying this. It's not one of these capillary action sort of things. I'll be doing a little bit of scrubbing, and that will polish off or wear off the pigments on some of those upper edges. And because it's in a slurry or it's been dissolved, the pigments have been dissolved, they will accumulate in those lower recesses and kind of give that effect of sand and dirt that have built up in the crevices and nooks and crannies of these rocks. So here's the big reveal. This is where everything starts going sideways. I get to about this point, and I'm just not liking the way the scene is laying out. The groundwork is fine. I'm not too worried about the groundwork. But I looked back as I started to actually produce this video, the earlier scenes, and as I laid it out on the little 8x8 board at the very beginning, I had the truck in a very different position, and I really liked and enjoyed where that truck was versus how, for whatever reason, I laid it out as I moved on throughout this process. Just wasn't paying attention. And so that means that I'm going back in over the top of everything, and I'm going to reposition that truck, which means that I need to go ahead and basically almost start from scratch again and redo this base and retexture it, recolor it, and everything else. I'll leave as many of the elements alone as I possibly can to recycle them. But this is a little bit of a bigger overhaul than just, continuing to finesse and stuff. So this will bring me basically to the end of this episode. So you are watching a work in progress that has definitely become a little bit of a more work than I anticipated in progress. So what does this mean going forward? Well, looks like the next episode, we're going to pick up right here where we left off with this one. I've got this base that is now more incomplete than complete, so we'll go through that process. I'll show you how I fix my mistakes. And I guess maybe that's a good thing to show is, yep, everybody makes mistakes, and it's not the mistakes you make, it's how you fix them. So I'm going to see what I could do about fixing those mistakes and see if I could bring this base back, because I'd like to bring this base back rather than maybe starting again. And if I'm quite honest with you right now, I'm a little bit frustrated, well, maybe more than a little bit frustrated, because I did want to try to bring this together for you in a single episode. But hey, like I said, everybody makes mistakes, including myself. So with that said, I'm going to call this episode complete, and we'll dust this off, and we'll start with the next episode where we show the progress. If you do like these episodes, this series, this channel, I do encourage you to hit that like and subscribe button. It does help this get out to more and more places. If you'd like to support this channel even further, I do have a Patreon page. The link for that is below. I encourage you to check that out. I do post quite a bit of additional content there, a little bit longer forms, some additional pictures, sneak peeks as to what's going on and what's coming up ahead. So check that out if you'd like. Until the next time, I should say, God, I can't even talk anymore. Until the next time, keep on modeling, have a good day, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care, guys.